Okay, I think we're going to get started if everyone is ready. It's a Friday afternoon of a long weekend, so I think we will try to start promptly and certainly end promptly. I have been a little in and out throughout this day, and I am incredibly impressed with the number of people that are remaining in this space, having gone to many conferences, and I'm sure my colleagues can agree this doesn't usually happen at a full-day event. So I think that's great support to the folks that have already been talking. You're sharing something valuable and interesting and exciting, and I think also a real tribute to the students that have organized this to make it a very interesting and engaging full day, and Professor Romero for supporting those students. So thank you all for staying, and I will kind of just get going on our final panel. I'm Alexi Freeman. I'm an associate professor of the practice here and oversee externships and public interest initiatives. I will tell you right on now, I do not know water law. I am a racial justice lawyer, but most of that work has been in education, voting rights, housing, etc. I think at one point I was asked about NEPA, and I sort of ran away. And it was a very complex law that I knew nothing about. So the focus of this panel, thank goodness, is really more on sort of moving towards action, right? We've had a rich, robust discussion of everything from sort of detailed ethical rules, right, to what different folks are doing. And I think this panel, what we're going to try to do is sort of think a little bit big picture, but also think a little tangibly, how can each of us in our various roles contribute to the movement and the intersection of water and racial justice. I'm going to briefly introduce our three panelists. It's going to be brief because these folks are incredibly accomplished, so I encourage you to look in your program if you haven't already. And I know our first person on the left has already joined us, so we thank her for doing double duty. Lizeth Chacon is the Executive Director of the Colorado People's Action. She formerly was Executive Director of Rights for All People. She also was a founding board member of the Aurora Welcome Center, now known as the Village Exchange Center, and she was the founding Executive Director of Colorado People's Alliance. Lizeth's organization is a racial justice member-driven organization dedicated to advancing and winning progressive social change locally, statewide, and nationally, and includes a water justice project, which, having worked with a lot of grassroots organizing groups, is incredibly rare. So it's exciting and a real honor to have you with us today. Next to Lizeth is James Eklund, who is of counsel as Squire Patton Boggs. In this role, James advises a range of private and public entities on environmental, public policy, regulatory, and legislative matters. Former director of the Colorado Water Conservation Board, former senior deputy legal counsel to Governor Hickenlooper, former attorney in the Attorney General's office, and also a Denver law grad. Thank you for joining us. And then last but certainly not least is Amy Beatie, who is currently running for a position in the Colorado House of Representatives. Prior to this, was the executive director of the Colorado Water Trust for some time. Prior to that, also practiced water litigation in a couple different private settings, and is also somehow, despite this election, also going to be teaching Denver law in the fall of water transactions. Is that right? So we appreciate your diligence and attention to DU Law School in many ways, and also as a DU Law grad. So with that, I think we've developed a few questions, and we also have a couple of questions that I think are useful that folks have mentioned earlier today and weren't addressed. The first kind of question I want to start with, and then of course I should say we will go to the audience for any kind of closing comments and questions as well. The first question is, as we I think have learned today, and I have long known, based on learning about water law a little bit from my colleagues here, both water law and racial justice, let alone the combination of the two, right, are incredibly complex and involve an incredible amount of different personalities, different frames, different agendas, etc. So, given that, how can we craft an agenda to move forward? Is that possible? What do you think are sort of the best concrete steps for moving something forward? Maybe we'll go this way this time first.
Okay. Thanks, you guys. Thanks for hanging in there. I know it's 4 p.m. So it's really nice to see all these friendly faces. I'm really I want to start before answering the question by letting you all know how honored I am to be on this panel. And when I come and speak here, I usually give a great plug to the DU Water Law Review. I want to do that today. The journal is so much more than a journal. If you look around this room, it's so much more than a law review that sits on a shelf in law firm libraries. And I want to honor Lindsay and her incredible vision to continue to grow Colorado water law into this new space and this new discussion. Today is exactly what the water law was set up to do over 20 years ago. I'm so excited to see these students asking tough questions and then challenging the answers. When I think about students today, I think to myself, we're going to be in great hands. I agreed to participate in this panel because it is incredibly important. It is also the intersection of two things that I have going on in my life right now. That is running for office and understanding that the heart of running for office is social justice, but it's also marrying together my background in water law. And to be clear, I'm an enthusiast on this panel, not an expert in this subject matter. So I'm hoping to share ideas that we've generated through discussion prior to this panel, but help us shape them and refine them and stop us and ask questions and use the spirit of engagement you guys have used all day today. And share your own successes and challenges, because I think that's the best way for us to continue to move forward is through this incredible community dialogue that has been kicked off today. So I had a lot of ideas about how we craft this agenda in moving forward. And I think the ideas range from the very small, very easy, to the very large and more aspirational. So bear with me, they're not in any real particular order. They're really just over the course of the day and over the course of thinking about this panel, some ideas that came up for me. I'm really inspired by Camille's work. She's sort of starting from scratch and forging ahead, and there is risk involved in it, and she's continuing to define what her project is intended to do. Can we form our own sister entity here in Colorado? That was sort of a big idea that came to me. Is it possible for us to figure out how we marry together water law and social justice in the state of Colorado at a sort of bigger institutional level, understanding that there are some areas where this is already occurring. There's the Protejete program with Conservation Colorado and Lizette's work. But is there a role to kind of create a center that actually focuses on these issues? And maybe it's not something totally new. Maybe this is a program that sits within the Colorado Division of Civil Rights, the Office of Civil Rights. There's been a debate in the legislature about the funding for that program, and that is the place where people go to have civil rights violations redressed in employment, housing, and public accommodation. Could we add water justice as a charge to that office? I think that's something that we could certainly think about. And could we inventory water security or insecurity in the state of Colorado so we understand a path to move forward? I'm not sure if something like that has already occurred, but do we need to look at communities across the state of Colorado to understand better their water quality, the reliability of their water supplies? You know, at the Water Trust, we worked with a municipal water provider that in 2002 that had a lake that was both a recreational amenity but also part of their water supply that looked like a mud flat. They were, days away or weeks away from losing their water supply. Can we inventory those communities and figure out if there, can we prioritize how we approach supporting those communities? I'm wondering if there's also a way for us to amplify Colorado's pro bono program. Justice Hobbs has been incredibly helpful in making sure that attorneys in private practice dedicate time and resources and energy to providing representation for indigent clients. I reread the language of the pro bono program, and it seemed okay in terms of addressing water justice, but I'd like to actually take a look at that language and see if we could expand out the pro bono program so that water firms could neatly fit into it and actually work on pro bono cases representing communities, disenfranchised communities, low-income communities, communities of color, and rural communities. I thought a lot about tribal water rights and the fact that 36 tribes have created or availed themselves of the system in some way, entered into statewide litigation or commenced their own securing of their water rights. And there are so many more tribes out there with uncertain water supplies, and so is it possible for us to inventory all of the tribes and rank them based on their water security, and then nest a program somewhere that helps tribes shore up their water supplies? And what would that look like? Is that funding in the Department of the Interior or the Solicitor's Office in order to support those tribal communities in securing their water supplies? It was interesting, I talked to Scott McElroy after his presentation, and he said securing tribal water supplies is really almost sort of addressing non-tribal water rights, because there's so much uncertainty about how tribal water rights will spring into our allocation system, that tribes, because they are careful about their role in communities, may not want to push their role, but then reciprocally, how do we deal with the fact that there are impacts to what people have come to rely on as their safety, security, and reliability of their own water supplies that have already been secured? I think we can also take some time really focusing on how we talk about water in the West. I ended up realizing, as we were having the conversation earlier about water as a basic human right, I start every presentation with somebody who doesn't know a lot about water by saying water is a property interest, separate and distinct from land ownership, and that you can own land and have a river run through it and not own a drop of water, and you can own water and it can flow through somebody's land. And so, I ended up realizing that if we shift the way we talk about water, we may actually start that conversation differently. So we can actually say water is a basic human right. However, in Colorado, water is also a property interest, and how do those two things kind of connect with each other? And it's sort of down to the smaller level, what if firms built unbundled legal services programs? We just sort of built in, water law firms tend to specialize. They were all in larger law firms, and in the sort of 50s, 60s, and 70s, you saw them peeling off to be able to have the flexibility to drive their own business models. What if boutique water law firms added a specialty in unbundled legal services so that they can help someone figure out what forms Zach had the slide up of all the various forms. It's pretty overwhelming. What if law firms actually built into their business model unbundled legal services? And I have probably 6 or 7 other ideas, but now I feel a little bit self-conscious that I've kicked this off by rambling through all these various ideas. So I'd love to turn it over to my other panelists and hear some of their thoughts and ideas as well. Thank you.
Let's go. All right. So I'm going to add my thanks to Lindsay and Josh and the whole DU Water Law Review team for putting this conference on. It's just been a remarkable day to sit through the entire thing, and my hats are off to you for taking on a topic that doesn't lend itself. It didn't probably jump right out and say, "Oh, here are the panelists that we want to put together," and so kudos to you for doing that. 3 simple points I think I'd like to make on this agenda question. Number 1, as uncomfortable as it is, we must face the power structures that produced our current system of water management. As the great civil rights writer James Baldwin said, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. 2, those power structures were white men, as Justice Hobbs, reading from the Reclamation pamphlet earlier, demonstrated. Those power structures produced our current system of water management, which governs how water is managed when water supplies are stressed, as we've talked about today. Wherever water stress occurs, there are winners and losers. The winners are those entities that are protected by the law and the management policies that created the system. The losers are those entities and interests not at the table but on the menu, as Ernest House Jr. said earlier. The communities that aren't enfranchised, the environment, communities of color, women's perspectives and interests, our youth. Right now, 3 of eminently qualified young people, 2 are women, were appointed by the governor to the Colorado Water Conservation Board, and they await confirmation in our state legislature. Typically, that's been done by now. They still sit and languish there. Some members of our legacy power structure are scared of those people because they're young and they might have ideas that are different than the ones they have. And that is terrifying to some members of the water bar in Colorado. So could it be because these people are not older white men that they're being slow tracked through the Senate confirmation process? Maybe. Those are questions to ask. And the third point I want to make is before we can change our system of water management in a more equitable way and in a more just way, before we can achieve water justice, as people have been talking about here, as Ernest House Jr. again said so well earlier today, we must understand how others value this resource. How do we do that? Well, in my opinion, forums like this one, they're critically important. If without these, many of us do not experience Mr. and Mrs. Martinez and Ernest House Jr. and Camille and Kayla and the rest of the leaders and thinkers from those outside the legacy power structure of white men. Without forums like this, venues like this, we live in our own echo chambers, and especially in the water business. The Martinezes described something important at the beginning of the day, really a sincere respect for the substance in the valley. You get this sense that it's more than a commodity when they use terms like mother ditch and water is life, and these are people who meditate while they irrigate. I love that. And have community protocol and ceremony in their annual meeting. Camille's testimony about the Matheny Tract and Kayla's witness to the Flint and South Bend, and Elizabeth on the 500 plus people in Commerce City and Montbello that are struggling with not feeling confident in their water supply. To me, these stories don't counsel the adoption of the public trust doctrine or New Mexico's Helen Ingram public welfare standard that we discussed, but what they do suggest is that we recognize and agree head on that we're dealing with a system of water law that was created by a patriarchal white male structure. Some would argue that the system, for that very reason, needs to be tossed out and rewritten more equitably. But we don't have the luxury of living in that kind of world, I'm afraid. That won't happen absent a massive crisis, and those sometimes do happen. If you look at Cape Town right now, they're questioning everything. Australia rewrote their entire water law system as a result of their millennial drought. So it can happen, but absent a massive crisis, I think what I advocate for, I guess, is facing our system and working within that system, as you're doing here, as many of the speakers you've heard today are doing, to achieve social justice in water the way Camille and Kyla and Elizabeth have done. To answer the agenda question, where do we go from here? In my opinion, two things should happen. One, Ernest House Jr.'s call for a voice, not just a seat, at the table should be answered. And that should be answered like yesterday. If the Ute tribes don't feel represented on a 15-member board that I used to run, the Colorado Water Conservation Board, we need to change that. They need to be represented on that board. Two, unfranchised communities need to be equipped with the tools of leadership to return the doctrine or prior appropriation to its innovative, disruptive, empowering self. When you look around the room, you may think that that's not the case. The doctrine of prior appropriation is often described by that power structure I was trying to get at as this thing that's not changeable, and that it's just the old status quo thing, and nothing's further from the truth. That thing, the doctrine of prior appropriation, was a very revolutionary, disruptive thing when it was created. It was a departure from the East. If you haven't heard Justice Hobbs talk about it, he does a much more eloquent job than I can about how we came up with that doctrine. But it was an answer to people seeing a need, and that the water law that we were going to inherit from the eastern part of the country and from Great Britain didn't work here. So we adopted this revolutionary thing. So don't get fooled by people that are maybe have become reliant upon the status quo never changing, because that ain't the way that doctrine grew up. That thing's an animal. It needs to be free and wild in a sense, and we've caged it for a long, long time. So we need to have it adapt. We need to adapt it to help us achieve water justice for these communities. And returning to James Baldwin, a note of optimism, I guess, and a warning against inaction. James Baldwin said in The Fire Next Time, which is a great book, you gotta read it, if we, and now I mean the relatively conscious whites and the relatively conscious people of color, who must, like lovers, insist on or create the consciousness of the others. If we do not falter in our duty now, we may be able, handful that we are, to end the racial nightmare and achieve our country and change the history of the world. If we do not dare everything, the fulfillment of that prophecy created by the Bible in song by a slave is upon us. God gave Noah the rainbow sign, no more water, the fire next time. So if we don't act, if we sit and rest on our laurels and say that this doctrine can't change because it's always been that way, when that's not true, then we will get the fire, and we will get a disruptive force in the form of a constitutional amendment that makes us adopt something that I think would be very disruptive and not necessarily helpful to the communities that need help in the public trust doctrine. We need that disruption, though. So I'll leave it at that and see if that kept people awake.
So you get to hear me twice today. How lucky, huh? No, but thank you so much to Lindsay and everyone for inviting me and trusting me to be in 2 different panels. So thank you so much for that. And then also just have to say, based on the last session, I'm so glad I did not decide to be an attorney. And I do not envy you at all. So just had to say that first, just because, I felt it and I was just like, I have to say it. But I'm gonna answer this question a little bit differently. And as organizers, we believe that one of the most powerful tools that we have as people is our stories, right? Because no one can tell us that our story is not correct, right? So I'm going to tell you a little bit of my story and hope that, following what you said, it's a little bit similar, that we inspire you all to just really take action. So I moved to this country when I was 12 years old, came here to Colorado, did not speak a single word of English. Less than a year and a half later, when I was in high school, I had a fellow student, a white student, that heard me speaking Spanish and called me and yelled at me and said, "Wet back, go back to where you belong," and physically came to me and pushed me south because I needed to go back to where I belonged. At that time, I just didn't understand the complexities. I just felt like I didn't belong, right? And then from there, I've had different experiences that have happened to me because of who I am and not necessarily because of what I've done. My mom doesn't really speak English, and she was literally yelled at and almost attacked at the store last year because she was speaking Spanish, and people told her, "We speak English in America," right? So my mom is facing that. My dad is close to coming to retirement age. He's worked at a meat packing plant for the last 18 years, and he's not going to be able to afford to retire, right? Our members, I see it and hear it every day. Some of them have moved out of the state because they can no longer afford to pay rent and live here in Colorado. We've had 3 members face deportation this year. One of them was deported and left the country in January of this year, leaving his children and wife behind. And he was the breadwinner of the family. So these are all things that I'm sharing because it's the things that I see every day. And just to say that I work the crazy hours and do this work because it's directly impacting me, right? So I believe that we're all being impacted by the issues and the crisis that we're facing on our climate, our economic justice system, and immigration system is affecting us all. And we are at a point that we can't choose to just sit at the sidelines and not do anything. If this is not the time to act, then when are we gonna act to stand up for our communities? So really just want to uplift that because I feel like I fell into this role because of what I faced and my experience in this country as an immigrant, but also because of the experiences of my family and the community that I work with that are suffering every day. So just to put a little bit of urgency that we have to act, and then also to say there is a role for every single one of us in this movement. You don't have to just be an organizer. You don't have to live in the community. There is a role for you. And to say that as law students or lawyers or anything, there's a really critical role that you can play for us in helping us understand how water law works. And I will give an example, right? On our work around local option right now for minimum wage, there's also a lot of legalities and complexities that go into that and the Constitution that me as an organizer, I can read as much as I want on it, but I'm still not going to comprehend what are the right things to do. And we've paired up with the National Employment Law Center. And they've been guiding us and helping us and giving us specific language of how do we actually change policy in Colorado so we can have an impact, right? So it's just to say that there's a critical and important role that you all can play in really creating positive change for our communities. So I would just say like that's one, right? Thinking about like what is your role, but also like I think when it comes to water, we're all impacted by it, right? Like I think I've been listening to too much NPR, right? Of like the water level is too low this year and like freaking out of like, you know, are we gonna come to like not having enough water, right? So I think there's a role for all of us. And then also I would say a clear action step is to start this work with humility, right? And to understand that we all have different privileges, right? I just told you my story, but as the director of the organization, I like to always check my privilege of regardless of what happened, I was able to go to college and get an education. That is not the case for everyone that I work with, right? I'm also privileged in the fact that I am not an undocumented immigrant. I am documented. So when I get in my car and drive, I don't have to worry about being pulled over and possibly taken away and deported from this country, right? So to say like when you start with humility and check your privilege, what is the privilege that you bring? And then also to not feel like you have to know it all. We do our organizing through a popular education model, right? And we always believe that you're always the teacher, but you're always the student as well. There's always something to teach and something to learn from others. And I think that if you take the position, I think that will make us, give us the opportunity to really move things forward with our community. And then also I would say, get out there and get involved, right? I think that we all sometimes live in our little bubbles, but I think until we're exposed to the real issues that our community is facing and you learn from them, and then you allow community to tell you what's best for them and then tell you how to support them, that is the best case scenario that we can have in really moving forward something.
So I don't know many lawyers, let alone lawyers in large private law firms who quote James Baldwin not once but twice. So I think that's indicative of the space that you all have created and certainly of your dedication as well to the work. So Alyssa kind of talked about this a little bit, but I'm wondering how you all would recommend, both from the legal side and also the organizer side, how lawyers can use traditional legal tools, right? So water law, you could be filing litigation, right? You could be going through the water courts and administrative process. How can you use these very traditionally legal that are kind of, I think, from this hierarchical system, James, that at least you identified, how can you use those tools in a way that supports the principles that I think Liz has just kind of outlined? Maybe we'll go this way. I don't know if you want to add anything to that too. Yeah, that'd be great.
And I mean, I don't think, I would say specifically to our work, and I feel like to be really transparent, we've gotten stuck a little bit in our water justice work just because, you all know, water law is really complex and we don't understand it. So we have to go through the step of like, as organizers and as staff people, like figuring out what does it mean and where do we need to look at to like figure out what the problem is in that area. And then we have to look at like the arsenal that's right in between Mobelo and Commerce City, the pipes. Well, how does Denver water work? How does Adams County water work? Is it the houses? When were the houses built? There's a bunch of research that we have to do that like has to do with a lot that we don't clearly understand. And then we have to turn around and turn that into education components to make sure that our community that lives in that area also understands how the system works and what could be the possible implications of the issue, right? So I think for me, I would say there's a lot of support that you all could lend on your expertise and your knowledge on the issue as well that could help organizations like mine that are on the ground, that we're not necessarily looking to be experts. All we're trying to do is find solutions to the issues that people are telling us that they're facing, right? And that could be something that could be really helpful. And then also to say, like I said a little bit before, like get out there, get involved, right? Like I think for us, it's like go meet the community, find out what's happening, and also just work with them on like what are the best issues while making sure that you allow them to be the ones that lead, right? And tell you what is the thing that they want to see change in their community. We connected earlier, that's why he's
Let's see, so water court is an interesting thing because, you've got Denver Water, as water providers in general are going to enter that world. They network through the Colorado Water Congress. There are many of you that are members of the water community that, go to the same conferences that I've gone to for the last number of years, and those are great for the inside baseball of the water community. But the vast majority of Coloradans will never touch water court. They don't know what it is. B, they don't own water rights. They're a customer of Denver Water. They're, I used to show a map when I was at the state of Colorado. 80% of our water is on. Well, it's great. Colorado has this beautiful attribute of being mappable on any piece of paper because we're a rectangle. So if I can tear it straight, that's the key, somewhat straight. If you draw a line down the middle, that's the Continental Divide. And so over here on the western side for you, the western slope, you've got 80% of our precipitation, and over here you've got 90% of our population. This is great. Right? That's it. And so we've got, like Dan was talking about, Denver Water and Northern Water, Colorado Springs Utilities, Aurora, Pueblo Board of Waterworks, all have about 25 to 30 trans-mountain diversions that move about 500,000 acre-feet of water from one side to the other every year. That's a lot of water. But most people are customers of those municipal water providers. And so they're not going to come in, the avenue to get them engaged and active and watching, not just watching, but active in protecting their water is really through their water provider, it isn't through water court. And Denver Water recognizes that, when it's kind of, they have to wear a couple of different hats. When they go to Water Congress, you got to talk about all the stuff that we in the water community talk about, CFS and acre feet and all that stuff, and what's going on with the compacts, the interstate compacts that we're a party to, and how water court rules are or aren't working, how they should be changed, what legislation should be read into the law to make some difference there. But when they go to their ratepayers, that's not what they're talking about. They're not talking about a second home in the mountains so they can have a stream to fly fish in. They're talking about watering their lawn that week. They're talking about getting confidence in the water that's coming out of their tap that day. And so there is I feel like there's a disconnect between the water community as a group in Colorado and the vast majority of the people that use the resource. And Denver, hats off to them. I think of all the water providers, they do a phenomenal job of making sure that that's a connection that people understand. Their counterpart over on the western slope where the Colorado River District, I think they do a pretty good job of helping their membership, all those counties over there that are underpopulated compared to Denver and the counties over here on the Front Range. They help them understand how this economic connection, we're tied at the hip. If if we go into a depression or a recession in Denver, the Western Slope's going to feel that. The Valley's going to feel that. And so helping everybody understand the connections is one part, but making sure that at least the vast majority of urban Coloradans understand a little bit about how they advocate and how have some tools to advocate for themselves and engage with a progressive water provider like Denver Water. I think that's really important.
So how many of you live walking distance from a coffee shop? Keep your hands up. How many of you are a 5-minute drive from a coffee shop? Okay, so that's basically everyone in this room. When I was beginning to do due diligence about running for office, I began to reach out to community leaders in House District 4. And I started asking questions of people. Who should I talk to and who should I meet with? And House District 4 runs from basically Federal Boulevard in Denver west to Sheridan, and then 52nd Street as the northern boundary to just south of Alameda. And if you're familiar with House District 4, you know that there's almost sort of a north part of House District 4 and a south part of House District 4. The north part of House District 4 looks like a lot of people in this room. The south part of House District 4 is heavily Latino and low income. And when I began to reach out to leaders in the southern end of House District 4, the very first person that I called, I said, I'll come south and meet you, and can we meet in a local coffee shop? And she laughed. And she said, actually, I would have to come all the way north to meet with you at a coffee shop. We don't have coffee shops down here. I could meet you at a muffler shop or a payday loan place, but I'm not going to be meeting you at a coffee shop in the southern end of House District 4. And I share this story with you because I think it's incredibly important for us to realize that the systems that we have created, James talked a lot about the sort of white male privilege systems that we've created, litigation and administrative processes, do not favor in many instances the communities that they're intended to serve. You're still here, don't be mad. But I went to go and I learned about Denver Water's free lead kit program. And since you had mentioned it on the panel earlier, I had my laptop open, and so I pulled it up and I went to go and order my lead kit because we actually got the mailer that said your house is in that age range where you actually might have lead pipes and you should begin to figure this out. So my husband and I had talked about doing it, and then we hadn't, and so I was sitting right here and you said it was as simple as filling out that form. So I pulled up that form and I filled it out and I submitted it, but what I ended up realizing was I was sitting in a room full of people with fabulous Wi-Fi. By the way, I would kill for the speed of this Wi-Fi in my home. With fabulous Wi-Fi with my laptop in a form that was in English. And so I was thinking about all of the folks that don't have access to Wi-Fi. We just passed a bill to provide broadband to rural communities. Fourth time, you know. So when we think about these systems and processes, we have to think about the who they are intended to benefit. So we need our processes tailored to the beneficiaries. So, and I didn't mean to criticize your program. I'm totally thrilled to have it. I just, you know, we have to meet people where they are. In my very first job when I left DU, I was working with a Wyoming nonprofit organization that was organizing in deep red rural Wyoming to address brand new impacts from an oil and gas development. And one of the things that I realized as a young female lawyer from Denver with a fairly liberal looking aesthetic, that I was walking into these communities to help them try and figure out how to address the impacts of this brand new gas development on their lands. And you do not show up and, you know, I heard somebody say this before, I think it might have been you. You don't walk into a community that you are not of and tell them what it's going to look like. You listen first, and sometimes you listen for years before you figure out where that overlap in the Venn diagram is. So I'm belaboring this point, but I've been thinking a lot about administrative processes, and we have, systems that people can avail themselves of if they have a laptop, if they have the time to go down to a particular office that may be located in Denver that's 2 hours away from them, in order to kind of work through these systems and processes. They may have 2 jobs. We hear that Colorado's economy, we have 2.3% unemployment rate. That's totally unheard of. But what I'm hearing from folks is, I don't need a job, I got 3, I need a good job. These are folks that are going from one job to the next, and they don't have time to drive 2 hours into Denver to go fill out a well permit form or so we have to figure out how to create our systems and processes so that they actually serve the communities that they're intended to serve. And I think a lot about actually sort of inventorying all of these systems and programs and reaching out to the communities that they're intended to serve to make sure that they truly do. And then the access to justice piece is a really big deal, and this is something that I think a lot of people have spent a lot more time thinking about than I have. But we work at the Water Trust. We worked in rural communities all over the state of Colorado, and there are folks who lived in a lot of fear about being able to protect what, for many people, especially in agricultural communities, have as the most essential asset for their business. That's their water rights. So if you're growing hay, if you have a cow-calf operation, if you're growing sugar beets, if you're growing corn, water is essential in the state of Colorado for you to be able to do that. And so in any conversation when you're talking with folks about doing something different with their water rights, their immediate reaction is, oh my God, I'm now going to have to go and defend in this very Byzantine system the most essential resource for my kind of paycheck to paycheck operations. I did some title work on some water cases when I was in private practice, and the title work for one farm was super complicated because they would secure a mortgage at the beginning of the year, then they would produce their crop, and then they would sell it and they would pay off the mortgage. And 2 years later, they'd remortgage their property because they were getting down to the bottom of what they'd been able to raise in their revenue. And then you want to add a litigation budget on top of that, that's going to be really, really difficult. So I think we still need to spend a lot of time figuring out how these systems and processes that we have are fair for everybody. And I need to spend a lot more time thinking about what that might look like, but certainly making sure that we have the folks that they're intended to serve able to avail themselves of those systems is going to be incredibly important.
So I want to make sure to leave some time for folks in the room to ask a question or two. But I also wrote a question that was not on the bullet points that I sent to you, so I apologize. But how do we make this a movement, right? How do we make this very complex area of law something that people care about, right? Like, how do we change sort of public narrative, right, about this issue? How do we make people care? How do we build the needed coalitions, right, among the folks that Liz's organization works with, the folks that are in the traditional space, right? How do we get law students who have been sitting in this space all day to feel like they can do something, right, to impact water law, but also impact marginalization at the same time? So I don't know if folks have thoughts or if anyone is eager to jump in first. Since it wasn't on the bullet point, I'll let whoever wants to go first jump in. But
I can go. I don't know if I have the correct answer to that, just because I think, in the nonprofit world where I work, I think we always ask ourselves that question. And I would just say with that, I think something that I want to add is Colorado sometimes is looked at as the state that other states look at for collaboration, specifically when it comes to nonprofits, right? I think I would say for the immigrant rights side of the world, I think there's a little bit over collaboration that happens on the work that we do on that side. But also I think on the economic justice side, right, there's a bunch of coalitions that we have to sit on and be part of to do the work. And I would say, like, on the climate side, I haven't been doing climate organizing for that long. It's been probably for the last 3 years. And I think there's a real lack of collaboration. And I think it's not just the water work, and I think the water work is even more or less. Like right now, our organization is the only one working in those areas on this issue. We are not collaborating with any other group. But I think the struggle, and I might get into some nonprofit jargon here, but I think like there's real tensions, right? And I think that's why I was glad that that today was addressing race specifically, and I'm gonna be really blunt here, right? We have the environmental side, right? The environmental groups that tend to be super white, that have a lack of a racial justice analysis and tend to tokenize communities of color for the purpose of winning and passing whatever policy they want to pass, right? That's the reality. And then we have the community groups that tend to be discredited by doing this work because we're not the experts on environment when it comes to that work, right? So that tension in itself prevents us from coming together to even start working together on the issues that we need to be working on. And the tension here for me is like, while we try to figure this out in the nonprofit industrial complex, our communities continue to suffer, right? Because we can't get our stuff together to figure out how to work with each other to make sure that we're actually addressing the issues that are impacting our communities every single day. So I would just say, like, that's one that I think that needs to be figured out. And then also I think that there's a real opportunity for us to, create those tensions, address those issues. And I think today is like a great start to do that. But there's also the side of like the law side that I think has been missing for us on the environmental side as well, of like how to address these issues. And I think that a movement that has been able to really master that has been the immigrant rights movement, if it's anything, right? We've seen everything that's happened in the last 2 years from the attacks from the administration, and immediately you see a response from community on the ground, you see a response from policymakers, and you see a response on lawsuits, right, that are questioning the legality of everything that's coming down from the administration. So we're able to respond in 3 different ways, and I think that that's a real example of how we can work across the different sectors for the same purpose that I don't think we've mastered in other areas of the work, and that we need to, and we have to, in order for us to be successful.
Well, you just heard from the experts, so there's not much more I can add there. That was that's spot on. The only thing I'd add is that Denver Public Schools has how many students? 80,000. 80,000 kids that are going to be hopefully sticking around a little bit and being our future generation of leaders. And very few of them, DPS did a survey in conjunction with Denver Water and asked them a few years ago, it's probably 5 or 6 years ago now, how many of you have been west of Wheat Ridge since you started at DPS? Guess what the percentage was? 80% had not. So when we, and again, not to beat this drum too much, but when we're in our water community safe space with all white NGOs that are really focused on what we think are really great things, we're missing the entire boat. I mean, the people that need to know about this stuff and be equipped with tools to advocate for themselves and their communities. We're not speaking their language, because water to them is coming out of a tap, or it's being used to irrigate their lawn. It's not it's not to go to a second home in Summit County to enjoy fly fishing on the weekend. That ain't happening for most of Colorado.
I have one small thing to add that may just be an echo and not new. And that is that we live in this world of wanting the world to customize itself to us. We have our news feeds and Facebook that reinforce our own beliefs. We are tending to live in communities where people share our political views. We tend to speak a lot to people who think a lot like we do. And Zach mentioned being uncomfortable, and I think it's about time we all got a little uncomfortable. I think it's about time we all started talking to a lot more people in an intellectual way, understanding that there is a lot of passion that drives the way that we all feel today. But I think one of the best things that we can do is sit at the dinner table with people that don't agree with us and have those tough conversations. So I have some very dear friends who support my campaign, and they're Republican, and I'm running in the 3rd bluest district in the state of Colorado, and their daughter asked what the difference was between Democrats and Republicans, And the dad said, the perfect way to ruin a good dinner is to talk about religion or politics. And then we didn't have the conversation with the 7-year-old who was so deeply curious about politics and what she's hearing about politics. And, we have this incredibly visible leadership in Washington, D.C., that's kind of being fed to these kids. So, there's a lot of discussion in my son's classroom around politics, and he's 7. And so I think we need to really talk. I think we actually need to make sure we talk to people that don't agree with us, that we learn from their perspectives, that, I really like the notion of the Venn diagram, because there's so much stuff that we actually agree on when we are talking to people who don't necessarily see eye to eye with us politically. So I just want to encourage everyone to go have some uncomfortable conversations with folks and learn a little bit more about other people's perspectives and show up with a really giant empathetic heart, because I think that's one of the ways that we bring people together to achieve really incredible things.
So I think we only have about 5 minutes left. Are there questions, comments that folks want to address generally or to our panelists?
I do.
Great.
You're talking about moving forward with some kind of an action plan, if I'm not mistaken. That feels like that is. I believe that we should form a clearinghouse. I live in a rural part of Colorado. I don't come to Denver often. And I believe that we need to connect with rural, with urban. Because I think we have a lot to share with one another. Urban living is so different, and I find it astounding. And then people come to my part of the world, and they're flipped out too. So I believe an interchange is helpful. And then the other issue I wanted to say was that, can you include rural issues or rural, like you said you were going to go through each service? I believe I heard that right. Each service that's available to the community, and you're going to go through it and make it available? Is that kind of what I'm hearing?
I was actually advocating for inventorying the services that we provide to make sure that they are making it into the hands of the people who we want to be able to avail themselves of those services. So for example, we have Denver is the center for a lot of administrative agencies. I'm not a master of agency budgets, but it would seem to make sense to me if we want people to connect better with the Attorney General's office. Could we put a satellite office in Glenwood Springs? And I'm using that as an example. There are probably a whole bunch of people in this room who are like, that's not possible. But I'm really just saying that there are things that I think we need to think about in the delivery of services that will soften the edges. And that's something that I would really like to take a look at.
Okay, and I agree, but of course we have our rural agencies. And I also wanted to discuss, for example, where we live, we have ditches that earlier somebody said, they don't go to court because they can't afford a lawyer. Well, we have a lot of ditches that have problems with proving their birthright, the community's ability to access water. We have a serious problem in our community that we can't get a cup of water out of the ditch, so a few people say. And we have some historical issues that I believe we need help with. We're just a poor community. I'm here to ask that if there are students who have a passion for rural water, for being in a rural part of Colorado, and I gotta emphasize, we have the best part of Colorado, and not north, because they're colder up north, but we're warmer down south. But thank you for expressing these issues. They're pretty neat. Thank you.
Awesome.
Thank you.
One more question or comment?
So there are one somebody else can ask it, I'm not sure. Is this on? Yeah, all right. This question is more or less for James, because the only technical water attorney up there. In your personal opinion, what incentives really exist for those who have water rights to adapt water-saving technology or methods when the historic use of a water user really determines the value of their water right? And do you see like alternative transfer methods playing a significant role in that, or do you think they're not going to have a whole lot of a future?
So alternative transfer mechanisms are, if you're not in this space and don't know what the heck that is, we call them ATMs, but most people think of ATMs as a different kind of a machine. An alternative transfer mechanism is, let me back up. If we continue to grow the Front Range metro area as fast as we're growing right now, the gap that Dan alluded to earlier on his panel will be so big that those new communities that are outside of Denver Water's footprint and service territory will have to go get water from someplace. We've already tapped in northern Douglas County, for example, we've already tapped the groundwater resource for the most part. And so that's not really available to us. The western slope, believe me, they're not sticking their hand up too high in the air saying, hey, come get it from here. That's where I'm from originally. And so these communities that are fast growing have to go to the place the market drives them. Where the market drives them is irrigated agriculture. They buy the water fairly cheap, relatively speaking, and they transfer it off the land. That's called buy and dry. That's the term of art we've heard. I heard a boo out there, that's good. We don't like buy and dry because it's food security and access to fresh produce that it's one of the brands of the state, and it's part of what makes being in Colorado so damn special. But so we don't like doing that. So if we're not going to do that, what are the alternatives to outright buy and dry? That's what an alternative transfer mechanism is. It's an alternative to buy and dry. Some of those are lease fallowing options for crops for farmers to take their land out of production, don't put water on the land, sell it to the city in a particular year. Right now you can do that 3 out of every 10 years if you're under one of the programs, one of the alternative transfer mechanism programs. The state needs to answer your question after all that background, needs to make more of those available. Because we, in the state water plan, put out a marker that we need 50,000 acres, 50,000 acre feet of alternative transfer mechanisms, alternatives to buy and dry, in place by 2030. And for us to hit that mark, because we're at 2018 right now, we've got to get a heck of a lot more creative, and we've got to implement a lot more of that. So when Amy's in the legislature, we all, as a water community, need to make sure we're equipping agricultural users with alternatives to buy and dry. Because right now, it's a pretty dramatic question that we ask families. If your kids aren't coming back to farm and ranch, and you're totaling up, like most small businesses have to, your assets and your liabilities, and your largest asset is your water right, a lot of times it's a business decision. And if you act in your own self-interest on those, then the tragedy of the commons can unfold, and that's bad for irrigated agriculture and ultimately rural Colorado. So to answer your question, I would say we need it bad, and we hopefully will have more tools coming online soon.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about ATMs. The Colorado Water Trust does ATMs. It's just that our I'm not there anymore. I'm never going to stop saying that. The projects, the end result is for the environment. We do these alternative transfers for the environment, we're working within the system and dealing with the historical consumptive use analyses. And my feeling is that it's a problem of scale the Water Trust was really set up to be people who sat around and thought 24/7 about how we share water between water users and rivers, and that it isn't an on-off, that it isn't 1 acre feet out of this use is an acre foot in the river. It's really how do we kind of create this a process where it's actually truly shared. You know, a lot of people say, when a community is here and they ask for a seat at the table, what they're asking for is this. And what we're actually asking for is this, right? So, and ATMs kind of create that ability to share and maintain a locus of control with the owner of the water rights. And one of the things that I had been thinking about was ATMs deserve some entity set up to think 24/7 about ATMs, the same way the Water Trust was set up to think about restoring flow to our rivers that are so completely over allocated that some of them are rocks baking in the sun and not rivers anymore. And so as we're moving ahead into problem solving, I would love to see somebody really creative and smart begin to figure out how we get somebody to spend 24/7 thinking about ATMs, and maybe that's setting up a new nonprofit. So that's just another idea.
So I think we can conclude that, well, at least I can conclude as someone who does not know this area of law, that marginalization is marginalization, right? It doesn't matter what the subject matter is. So I encourage folks to challenge yourselves, to collaborate, which I think was one of the key things here, to learn from each other, and frankly to redefine who you ask the question to redefine who you see as the expert, right? Because I think we're all sort of experts in this work in various different ways. I think there's a lot of hard questions and very few easy answers. But I think we all can agree that it's probably time to act, and it's probably been time to act for a really long time on this issue, and it's time to kind of act across lines, across lawyer organizer line, across racial justice, environmental lawyer line, across different subject areas. I want to thank our organizers for planning a really robust discussion today. I want to thank our panelists for holding it down for the last panel of the day, and I think we have a reception of food and drink in the forum, and I encourage folks to stay, continue to collaborate, share ideas, and brainstorm together. Thanks for joining us.